Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Global Apparent Sourcing Expo organized by the International Apparent Federation together with the Sourcing Journal and ForSource. I'm Stefanie Schröder, Senior Manager from Strategy and the Strategic Consulting arm of PwC. And we help established fashion brands and retailers, but also startups to develop a future-proof strategy and adapt their business model accordingly. I'm very happy to be here today with Nelson Holzner, the co-founder and CEO of MODIFI, a Europe-based company focusing on digital trade finance solutions. Hi, Nelson. How are you today?
Hi, Stephanie. I'm good. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks for taking your time to be here with us. So I would also like to hand over to you to better introduce yourself and explain a bit how you actually ended up at MODIFI, and then also tell us more about how MODIFI innovates the fashion industry.
Sure. So thanks for having me, Stephanie. So my name is Nelson Holzner, CEO and co-founder of MODIFI, and we are a digital platform which provides trade finance for small and medium-sized companies. And how come that we came across this idea some 3 years roughly. My co-founders and I, we were already in the fintech space, so I had already started another financial technology company called BillPay, which served some thousands of small and medium-sized online merchants, many actually in the fashion industry. And we provided payment services to them, and we're very aware of their working capital needs and how they make money, when they need to make money, when they actually get paid their invoices. And sometimes it is a bit of a stretch to manage then on the one side, the supply side, where your suppliers want to be paid, and then the customers themselves, they also want to pay as late as possible. So we bridged in the first business a bit like the consumer side of things, and MODIFI is now tackling the space and helping small and medium-sized companies to optimize the working capital more on the demand side of things. All right. Today I want to talk a little bit about making it happen. I think in these days, not so easy for everyone in the fashion industry. And since we are a financing company, for us, it's really more about buying time during a global crisis like we are living through with digital solution. I think that is quite important in these days. So obviously, I think everybody faces its own challenges these days, and we are serving obviously buyers and sellers on one single platform. And I think everybody has also a little bit their own agenda, right? So the buyers, they are facing a slump in demand. When you look at the pandemic, I think we saw some drop in 50%, I think, in fashion and fashion accessory sales in the US. In late March. So very, very difficult to really also understand what kind of orders do I really want to place, what kind of orders can I cancel maybe even. So a huge uncertainty about demand, and that also paired obviously with diminishing revenues, with a very, very weak liquidity position for many buyers in this environment. On the other side, the sellers or exporters, they also face quite an uncertainty because they are eager to serve on orders, but they are unwilling to trade on the open account terms, i.e. to send the goods and then wait for them to get paid, because I think they rightfully fear that some of their buyers might not be around at the time when the payment is due, because we do see also very, very large brands really having a hard time in this environment to stay afloat. And or when they stay afloat, they also sometimes take unilateral payment holidays, as they sometimes call it, which ultimately means for an exporter that they have to wait a lot longer for the payment. And the smaller the seller or the exporter it is, the harder obviously it is for them to wait for money. And I think that is, one of the key difficulties I think buyers and sellers face. And when you take into account that roughly 60% of global trade is ultimately being financed between the discussions of buyers and sellers, so not even banks involved. It always is about who delivers what and who pays what at what point in time. And these discussions are getting much harder in this environment with COVID-19, tough demand situation, but also really difficult assessment of default risk. So I think the trading landscape as we see it in our customer base is that the exporters and sellers are very, very desperate for orders. They're building up their capacity. China is more or less up and running again, but also countries like India, who are still in lockdown, have people back in the factories and are basically willing and able to produce. But now they are looking for orders, and that is sometimes also difficult. Again, also taking into account that they have to then think about where do I actually send my goods to, what buyers are good for paying me, and how do I manage somehow that I have to pre-finance production and maybe wait until I receive payment for my goods. And only the largest buyers and sellers can dictate terms. And I think, and especially in the apparel industry, you often don't really have a level playing field, but rather large buyers on the one hand, and then small and medium-sized exporters, manufacturers on the other end. So those small and medium-sized exporters and sellers have a much, much harder time to really then also reject for example, requirement that they grant very long payment terms. And I think that is, the trading landscape, which is quite demanding. If we move on. I think on top comes something even beyond the control, of buyers and sellers in that fashion industry here. And that is, infrastructure, especially ports. So we call it the uncertain shipping landscape. What we saw quite a bit in the last 2 months is that, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, that fashion and apparel was not considered essential goods by the port authorities, for example. So they would delay the shipment and the processing because they had also fewer staff who could actually run the things and prioritize the essential goods such as medical supplies and others, which ultimately meant for many buyers and sellers that they basically no longer have control over when things are getting shipped, which is also very, very tough, obviously, for buyers because they rely also on timely delivery, that they also can, sell the right garments and apparel in the right season. So I think that was something even beyond the control, and I think that is still something which is a challenge for everyone because what we also saw is that only one case of COVID can actually shut down more or less critical parts of infrastructure such as ports, and that is beyond the control of the buyers and sellers in that industry. On top comes the overall global liquidity crunch, and I think this is also where we come into play. I mean, slump in global trade means ultimately also less money, less revenues for buyers and sellers. At the same time, banks are being very careful now about lending and loans, and they review lines of credit, for example. They cancel limit or reduce limits, withdraw the lines. At the same time, the governmental stimulus packages are also a bit hard to really predict when they arrive at the buyers or sellers who need it. So we see lots of large headline numbers of rescue packages, but really comes down to how to distribute the funds, for example, and at what point in time people get hold of the funds. It's much, much harder. So I think it's also not really an option for buyers or sellers to really count that package in their business planning. So I think the typical risk mitigation techniques which we see in other crises normally don't really help in, I think, this special situation. So net, I think competition is fierce because everybody wants to sort of, sell the goods. Everybody wants orders. Speed is of the essence. And it's super important, I think, for everyone to also really have a good view on their cash position to also ensure that they are able to deliver what they basically order or what they want to sell or what they need to produce. So that is, I think, also something quite tough to manage, especially in countries which are maybe not that developed than Europe or the States sometimes. So what do we see now? And I think sometimes it is worthwhile looking back at other crises. And while the COVID-19 crisis is, I think, quite unique, when we look back some 10 years for the big financial crisis, the banking crisis, I think what we saw between trading parties that they tried to mitigate risk with a bit like old school solutions like letters of credit, for example, which would also be a means of financing certain trades and ensure that payment is being done. So what we saw when we look at the data from 2008 and 9 is that while letters of credit are no longer the preferred means of financing, they saw quite a quite a spike actually in the times of the crisis when like their use was more than double than it was before. So we'll see how that also plays into the current environment, I would say. But I think the old methods of risk mitigation, obviously like 10, 12, 14 years old, and may not be suitable in this environment. And when we look at the next slide, I think this is then where digital solutions come into play, especially also solutions like what we are providing at MODIFI, really helping buyers and sellers to ultimately buy themselves time with digital solutions. And I think why is that so important? Yeah, so I think if we look at the crisis over the last few months, I think if there's one good thing about it, maybe that COVID-19 is ultimately a catalyst for a long overdue digitalization of international trade and also international trade finance, because the international old school tools are very much based on paper and physical documents. And that is obviously something which is very, very difficult in closed offices or factories, where most of the people who are dealing with those items are white-collar staff, which are not necessarily working anymore in the factories. So we have had already a couple of cases where everything was actually up and running. The goods had been transported to the port already. Everything was good for shipment, but the bill of lading was still in the factory, and nobody actually could access that factory because it was sealed off because of the COVID-19 crisis. I think that makes it very, very tangible why the single point of failure of physical documents is something we really have to overcome jointly. And at MODIFI, we started to do just that and work completely 100% digital. So what we are doing on this platform is that we help buyers to delay payments up to 120 days. When they order goods, for example, and they have to pay up front, they could basically use our platform to delay the payments for up to 120 days. On the same platform, when you basically take a seller's role, you're an exporter, we allow you to provide payment terms to buyers who otherwise might not be willing to place the order. And well, granting payment terms is the one thing, but then are you able to actually afford that? That's the other thing. And this is where we step in and then pay upfront a significant amount of the invoice to the seller so that they can have already cash in hand and pay salaries, pay the next garment delivery, for example. Yeah, so it's a very straightforward process. We try to be as simple as possible because trade finance sometimes is actually quite complex and there's a lot of products flying around there. So what we are doing is once either a buyer or a seller is onboarded on MODIFI, they simply log in the website and they upload invoices because it's all about financing invoices. So a buyer, for example, would upload an invoice over $100,000, which need to be sent to a supplier, let's say in China. Today, he would upload the invoice. He would tell us, wire $100,000 to my Chinese supplier. So we wire 100% of the invoice to the supplier or seller. The goods can then be shipped from China to Europe, for example. And the buyer pays us back 30 to 100 days later. So typically that is enough time for receiving the goods, getting them through customs, getting them through the warehouse, and then selling them on to their own customers. So they basically earn enough money from the goods to pay us back later. And it's really mirrored for the exporters. It's the same portal, so to say, the same website. Sellers would also log in. They upload the invoice and say, look, I have a $100,000 invoice against, let's say, a US buyer. We would then fund 80% of the invoice value to the exporter, let's say an export in India. And then the buyer in the US would pay us according to what is in the invoice, let's say 30 to 120 days later. And once MODIFI receives the funds from the buyer, we release the remaining 20% to the seller so that the seller has the entire invoice paid ultimately. So super straightforward, very, very easy to do. And I think, again, 100% digital. Yeah, so I think what the key value really is, I think it's really a super fast financing solution. So you can get financed within 10 minutes online. You can actually have cash in your bank account 48 hours later. This is compared to normal lending schemes or credit processes spectacularly fast. So typically you would have 2-3 months for actually getting a credit from your bank before you can actually have the cash in hand. We basically bring it down to a couple of days. think another super important point is the risk protection piece. So for the export financing, seller financing, we cover the credit risk of the buyers. So the exporters don't have to worry about will these buyers be around by the time they need to pay me? Will they have enough money? Will they be insolvent or not? Especially in this volatile environment here, this is a super important piece of the value proposition, and it's extremely flexible, right? So since it's so digital and everything is web-based, you can apply for finance anytime from anywhere, 24/7. We don't require any collateral or guarantees or other physical documents. And I think this is why the entire process is so smooth and fast. And when time is of the essence, I think that is quite an interesting value proposition for buyers and sellers. So I think, and then on the platform, obviously there's also lots of other functionalities behind it. So it's powered by a very sophisticated big data engine for analytics and fraud detection. We can connect to systems on the buyer or seller side on ERP systems. We offer the first foreign exchange optionalities and features so that people can switch between currencies, say from euros, but settling in dollars or the other way around, for example. And everything is basically fully available for all the parties. They can actually also meet on the hub, what we call the hub, and check the status of the orders, check the status of the payouts, how much limits still do they have, can they upload the next invoice, when is the next repayment due, for example. So all in one place. And I think that is, again, like a very powerful value proposition, especially if you are in a remote world where you don't have access to your office and can check paper files, for example. Yeah, and so far we have some 500 trading parties on the platform working in more than 40 countries across multiple verticals. So we don't do only fashion, but we do quite a bit of fashion, I would say, and are obviously like super eager also to help small and medium-sized companies to trade even better and get really on the level playing field like their big counterparts or other larger providers who have a bit of an easier access to finance, especially in times of crisis. I think that's really about the solution we have put in place, and which we believe in a digital age. I think digital trade finance is part of the journey, and I think this crisis is really helping us to achieve that joint goal to work with less paper, less printouts, and more faster, better, and more flexible solutions in finance. So I think that's pretty much what we are doing at MODIFI, and how we try to help also the apparel industry to overcome this crisis and to buy themselves time where they need it. So I think that's, I would say, the end of the presentation. If you want to get in touch, you also see my contact details on the last slide, which will be shared later. So we're happy to get in touch with you and discuss how we can help also your business or your counterpart's business.
Yes, Nelson, thank you very much for this interesting introduction. I think it's really a valid solution for both sides, so the supply side and the demand side, to really manage the current crisis effectively. And I would like to ask you two follow-up questions to get some further insights for our audience. So the first one is, how do you plan to further enhance the use of the MODIFI solution?
Yeah, I think, I mean, like there's actually quite some features available already, but I think a product is never ready, right? So I think we always see that there's more processes which we can bring online and digital, be it a bit more exchange between buyers and sellers on the same platform, that you can get trade confirmations better done, that you can also maybe even adjust invoice values, which I think is also something people don't really think about unless you actually do the trading, because like every single purchase order and invoice is being touched multiple times before they really become effective. So all these things typically trigger quite a bit of back and forth between the parties outside of a software platform, and we're trying to smoothen those things. I think more currencies are becoming more and more important, especially also when you see how trade is a bit shifting sometimes, right? So I see also, for example, that Chinese exporters do not rely exclusively anymore on the Western world, right? So I think we see quite a big of an increase of the trade from and to China from within the Asian region. I think this is also something which then also requires a certain level of localization, be it also language-wise, support-wise. I think those things have to be built out in a global platform. I think English gets you very far, but ultimately, especially when it comes down to financial services, people also like to have the local touch, I would say.
Understood. And the second question is around the product offering. Do you also plan to introduce any new products beyond the current trade finance solution?
Yeah, I think partially already we have it as a bit like a cockpit even. So I think everybody would like to not only lend money but also provide additional services, right? And I think there's lots of analytics we run in the background which we can also partially share, for example, which interested parties. I think many times when we, for example, have to set a limit to a certain counterpart, people want to understand why that is and whether they could maybe even go beyond, or whether they could kind of share the risk in a different way so that they can make trades financeable with their own balance sheet, so to say, or with their own recourse. And I think those are data points we have quite a bit of, and I'm more than willing to also share and make it a bit more like transparent how our decisions are being made and how we can help each other. And I think the third piece is also how do we then also ensure that whole ecosystems can use MODIFI, right? So ultimately, when you have a buyer-seller relationship, you always have already two people using the platform per se. So it's a bit like in payments, quite frankly. But then when you also combine with other data, you also see typically one exporter doesn't have only one buyer, and one buyer has not only one supplier, but multiple suppliers. And I think the more people actually use a platform, the more people are getting used to it, for example, and I think then can overcome also, especially the starting piece. I think the onboarding piece is probably the most burdensome. Once people are up and running, people use us very, very often. So I think on average, even the small guys use us 7 to 8 times a month. So a lot more than what we have initially expected. And so I think it also speaks to the quality of the product per se. Yeah, so people use it like a working capital line, but it doesn't come along with all the tough requirements of a working capital line.
Thanks a lot for the insights, and I really look forward to hear more about MODIFI in the future.
Thanks a lot for having me, Stephanie. It was great also to present, and really hoping that the conference goes well.
Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.